focus of attention just now at church is this story of Ruth. Happened 3,500 years ago when the judges judged. That's why you can find the book of Ruth just after the book of Judges and just before 1st and 2nd Samuel and all those stories about Samuel and David and Solomon and all the rest of those kings. But instead of the usual accounts of all those very important people in the Bible that surrounds this story, this account, this scrap of Israel's history, is about an ordinary family, just about as ordinary as you or me. It's about an ordinary family, and it's about a family on the move. A recent article in the Guardian newspaper had some amazing statistics. I actually brought it and left it behind. There it is, the Guardian Weekly. And I don't know if you can see it from here. I should have put the picture on the screen. It's called The Great Displacement, the cover article, How Migration Became the Biggest Story of Our Times. And in this article, it says that 2017 was the year that saw the largest number of people living outside of their country of origin ever. 250 million people altogether. And 66 million of those people globally are experiencing forced displacement. That's a lot of refugees and asylum seekers and displaced people. They come from Syria and Afghanistan and South Sudan and lots of other places as well. They're fleeing for their lives much of the time, and all of them are hoping for a better, safer place to raise their family and bring up their children. The mass movement of people, the newspaper concluded, is arguably the biggest story of our time. And the book of Ruth, you might remember from last week and from your knowledge of the Bible, the book of Ruth started with Elimelech and Naomi, this couple from Bethlehem, and their sons fleeing the famine in Israel and heading kind of around the Dead Sea and across to the other side to Moab. And years go by, the sons marry, then Naomi's husband dies, then the two sons die, and Naomi is feeling all alone in a foreign country. The book of Ruth begins with those tragedies and Naomi's subsequent decision to return home to Bethlehem. And at the end of chapter 1, Naomi trudges back to her hometown, still terribly bitter about all the things that have happened to her. And as her former friends greet her by name, she insists, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Call me bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Stop and just sense that impoverishment, that desolation of spirit, that horrible feeling that Naomi was feeling then. Try to feel how alone she feels, how threatened, how hopeless and without ways of going forward. So many people are all around us in those situations. Some of those people are us. Naomi was bitter and empty. But in the midst of this bleak beginning, Ruth chapter 1 also offers us a glimmer of hope. Because despite Naomi's sense of emptiness, there, right beside her, was Ruth, her daughter-in-law, who had insisted on coming with her. On the road out of Moab, she had clung stubbornly to Naomi and even entrusted herself to Naomi's God, the Lord of heaven and earth. She would go to Bethlehem with Naomi and help her no matter what. And so immediately after reporting Naomi's bitter complaint about leaving full and coming back empty, the narrator of this story tells us that there's Ruth standing beside her, and in the background, fields ready to be harvested. The best time of the year. The fullest, greatest time of the year. And so, although words of bitterness and sadness and disappointment and hopelessness come out of Naomi's mouth, the scene around her is one that hints toward fullness and promise, of fertility and a new future. And our God gives new futures to the hopeless people. Our God gathers in the people from the university and the public housing areas and the fancy houses in the South End and all the rest. Our God gathers in the desolate, despairing people and gives them new reason for hope. Chapter 2, which is our concern this morning, tells us what happened one day after that, during that same harvest. At the very beginning of the chapter, the narrator tells us a crucial fact that Ruth doesn't know yet. They're kind of sitting around the table, not enough food for breakfast. They're wondering what desperate things they can do to make ends meet, and they talk it over and decide, perhaps Ruth says, I could glean after the harvesters. There were rules, there were laws in Israel, enlightened laws that said, in order to be kind to the poor, don't pick up every last scrap of thing when you're harvesting your olives or your grapes or your wheat or your barley. Don't pick up every last bit. Don't harvest right to the very corners of the field where it's more difficult to get at. Leave those things, those places, that harvest, that food for the poor among you. But I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? The story, the chapter starts with the narrator telling us, not telling Ruth, not telling Naomi, telling us about Boaz. A crucial fact that Ruth doesn't know. He lets us in on one of the mysteries of the story ahead of time. You see, Naomi had a relative on her husband Elimelech's side, and he's a man of standing, prominent and well off, whose name is Boaz. Naomi had long since lost track of him. Ruth had never even heard of him. But if there was a relative, if just possibly there was a relative, that might mean a possibility to get a leg up. That might mean family support. It might even mean economic rescue and redemption. But Ruth doesn't know it. On the morning of that day, with Naomi's blessing, Ruth heads to the fields for food, hoping to pick up the leftover grain, as she put it, behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. That's the Bible's way of saying she could be anywhere. She could be in any one of hundreds of different fields with hundreds of different owners. And then come the words that I've chosen for the title of this morning's sermon, as it turned out. As it turned out, Ruth was working in a field belonging to a man named Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. It just so happened that the field Ruth picked belonged to Naomi's long-lost relative. It just so happened. It turned out that Ruth went to the one field where there might be somebody who would help, who could make a long-term difference in her and her family's, Naomi's, life. And we know, don't we? We've been told ahead of time in this story. We've learned already from our Christian upbringing, many of us, that God has acted already for our benefit. That God has a providential care for us, an overarching compassion and understanding and helpfulness for us that is just unparalleled. That this is not a universe that God wound up and just let it go according to natural laws without any further involvement from God who doesn't want to get his hands dirty. No, God has been intimately involved in our world ever since he made it. And because, we perhaps know how this story ends. Maybe some of us don't. It's been a long time. But we've been told at the beginning of this chapter that Boaz is the one. And there, look at that. She ends up in Boaz's field. It just so happened. And how many times does this happen in our lives, I wonder? That it just so happened that we read that verse on Verse of the Day. That we met that person who would make a difference in our lives. That we turned that job down and got that job instead, and look where it's led. It just so happened. I think that sometimes we get caught up as Christians thinking that God just acts miraculously. And sometimes we even just expect big miracles and then get disappointed when they don't happen. We want something dramatic and earth-shattering to happen, and that will prove to us that God is in it. But the truth is, as the book of Ruth tells us, that God is working in the ordinary things of every day. We're looking for someone amazing to show up in our lives, and there's somebody right beside us who's trying to be amazing for us. We're looking for a huge life change that might drastically impact our situation, and God is trying to work step by step in a way that would drastically change our situation. God is working his purpose out as day follows day, often, mostly, unsurprisingly, just with almost no fanfare. And we often think of grace as a power instead of a personal relationship. We think of God as a supernatural wonder worker instead of one who walks alongside us day by day, hour and minute by minute. And God's not in the business, hardly ever, of intervening in our lives in a way that turns them upside down and gives us hardly no choice. God is almost always, all the time, involved in our lives in small ways that make an eventual big difference. There's a great verse in the New Testament where we're instructed to work out our salvation in fear and trembling. Because it's God who works in us to do and accomplish everything that happens. So don't sit there and wait for God to do something amazing. Listen to the Lord as he urges you step by step to do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And then, keep your minds open, of course. God can well do amazing things overnight, too. We shouldn't be too surprised. But we shouldn't be neglecting the fact that God is working in the ordinary things day by day. Well, as this day that we're looking at in Ruth chapter 2 unfolds, Ruth discovers that Boaz is an individual who trusts in the Lord and even brings his religious convictions into his workaday world, as verse 4 shows us. The Lord be with you, he says, to the people in the field, the workers and the gleaners and all the rest. And they say, the Lord, Yahweh, bless you. Here's a way to amaze your Anglican and Roman Catholic friends. When they have communion, they almost always begin with, the Lord be with you. And the people reply, and with your spirit, or something like that. This is where that phrase comes from, the Lord be with you. It's the one time in the Bible that those words show up. Just might not hurt to know. You could use it someday. And furthermore, as it turned out, the godly farmer takes an interest in one particular gleaner. The field supervisor tells Boaz that the woman came from Moab with Naomi. And what's more, she's polite and hardworking. You know what's happened? In just a short time, Ruth has developed a reputation, a good reputation. This foreigner who nobody has ever met until the harvest was just starting has already been known as the daughter-in-law of Naomi. She's related to Naomi, who they knew from before, from years before, and Ruth had courageously accompanied Naomi from Moab. She asked for permission to glean in the fields, just didn't take it as her right, even though it was. And she's kept at it and persevered, worked hard through the day. And with every bit of effort, every little contribution, every aspect of her character that comes out in a little bit of conversation, the word spreads around and people say, "Oh, Ruth, you know her? She was kind of impressive. She's," etc., etc. The word was going around. And then Boaz spoke to Ruth personally. He welcomes her to his field, promises her that she'll be safe, and even shows her how to use the water cooler. As it turned out, Boaz refused to dismiss her because she was an immigrant and an outsider, but saw her instead as a person with whom he could be in relationship. Now, let me just touch on the interracial things that are going on. Lots of societies have lots of trouble with these things, with seeing somebody different and thinking, "I don't want to know them," or even worse. But Ruth's example, and Boaz's example in particular here, is teaching us a godly thing: to look past the color of one's skin, to look past their country of origin. "Oh, she just lives in Moab. What good could come from Moab?" And instead, to evaluate her in terms of her character, her reputation, to get to know someone rather than to prejudge them. And here's another little thing to notice in this. I'm not going to say a whole lot about it today, but a little bit in a couple of weeks' time when we do chapter 3. Can you feel a little bit of the romantic tension beginning here? You get a sense that Boaz might be interested in this foreigner? There's also the negative side of that romantic tension. Did you notice the part about how Ruth would be safe in his field and not to go to another one because she might be harmed? We live in a world where women experience all kinds of unwanted attention. What a time to mention that in our world. The people who were glued to their screens, as a man and a woman testified the other day. Well, more about that in a couple of weeks' time, but those are some of the ingredients in this story. That interracial tension, that romantic and even sexual tension, all kinds of question marks coming up, all kinds of interesting hints about what might be true and what might happen as a result. Ruth asks Boaz, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" And then Boaz says, "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Why is he interested in her? Well, I think there are several reasons. But the one that this text tells us, this verse 10, tells us is that he is willing to bridge the divides that separate foreign countries. And he's willing to do that because of his faith in Yahweh, the Lord, the God of Israel. And he wants her to be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. He recognizes that the work he does, the effort he makes to care for the poor, is work that God is doing to provide refuge for people in Israel. And that's true as you and I support various causes like Souls Harbor Rescue Mission and Ride for Refuge, as we think about how those who have less than us could be impacted positively by our wealth and generosity. We are motivated by a faith in Jesus Christ, who had the poor at his heart, and a faith in the Lord of history, who wants all economic stratas, everybody, to turn to him and receive all the benefits, all the blessings that they could experience as he gathers them under his wings like a mother hen gathers her chicks. Jesus, remember, showed up at the edge of Jerusalem, looking over into the valley and up to the gates and the buildings. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often have I longed to gather your children together. And God's heartbeat is still to gather in the people who would help, who would be helped especially, who would be saved by Jesus, who would be blessed by our attention, who would be fed by our hospitality. And as it turned out, there's that word again, this unusual friendship developed as Boaz invited Ruth to the meal table. The end of verse 14 says that she ate all she wanted, and she had enough left over to take to Naomi. At the end of the day, Ruth's harvest amounted to about an ephah of the threshed barley. And depending on whose numbers you believe and which translation you read, that's 30 pounds of grain, 3/5 of a bushel, 22 liters, or almost 15 kilograms of hard to carry home barley and wheat. God made a measurable difference in Ruth and Naomi's lives that day. Instead of just a little bit of grain that would make enough for next morning's porridge, they had enough for the next 2 weeks. But Ruth wasn't going to stop. She was going to be there the next morning, as you'll see. Let me ask, what are the tangible blessings in your life? What are the ways that God has enriched you? I mean, how has it been that you've headed out for the day and expected to gather up this much, just this much of God's blessing? And you go home with so much you can hardly carry it all. Just imagine the 15-kilogram bag of flour on your back. God blesses immensely. We've been given a full measure, pressed down, flowing over, to use Jesus' very vivid metaphor that I think is going to be the text for next Sunday's Thanksgiving sermon. We've been enormously blessed. God has been so good to us. That evening, and here we draw to a close, when her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered, we're just at the end of this one day that Ruth chapter 2 dwells on. That evening, when her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered, Naomi was keen to find out where she had gleaned that day. The name of the man I worked with today is, what was it she says to herself? Boaz. Oh yes, Boaz, that's the name. The Lord bless him, says Naomi in verse 20. As it turns out, that man is our close relative. He's one of our kinsman redeemers, one of our guardian redeemers. He's one, well, I have to use a long explanation for this, but that's 2 weeks from now. You don't have to look at your watches. Just the explanation that you'll need for 2 weeks from now, we can save till then. But the key word for now is that word, redeemer. He was one who, because he was a kinsman, because he was a relative, could make a big economic difference in their lives. As it turns out, Naomi says, that man is our close relative, one of our guardian redeemers. But at the end of the story, at the end of chapter 2, rather, we want to take a deep breath and realize that almost nothing spectacular has happened in this story, in this chapter. Oh, well, maybe a little bit spectacular when you think about how much grain is on Ruth's back as she walks home after a long, hard day at work. But through 20-some verses, we're told over and over and over again how God is putting the ordinary stuff together to make extraordinary results. That's how God is working with your life. Bit by bit, decision by decision, day by day, in ordinary events where you decide and I decide to hang on to God for dear life, to do the next thing that the Lord would lead us to do, to trust in Jesus just a little or just a little bit more. The ordinary things that happen, God's working through them. And God's working through Boaz and Ruth, you'll see in a couple of weeks, to bring good, not just to them, but to Naomi. And don't skip ahead to read the very end of the story. Well, maybe you might. That's okay. But not only to Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, but God is determined to bring something good for us out of this as well. Amen.